Welcome back to Velshi and Rule. President Trump's eldest children can possibly breathe a sigh of relief today. That is because the special counsel's report revealed their investigation has not led to indictments for any of them. Don Jr., Ivanka, Eric, and Ivanka's husband, Jared Kushner, all in the clear of any charges so far by the Justice Department. But each is mentioned in the report, and some more often than others. Let's start with Don Jr., who makes the most appearances. The report touches on his interactions over the infamous Trump Tower meeting and his correspondence with WikiLeaks. Then there's Ivanka Trump, who also serves as senior White House advisor. She's mentioned as being present at a meeting in the days before the Trump Tower meeting in which Don Jr. announced he had a lead on, quote, negative information about the Clinton Foundation. Her husband, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and senior White House advisor, is mentioned a whole lot of times in the report, including his meeting with Russian ambassador to the United States at Trump Tower. And then there's Eric Trump, not mentioned very often, but he is in there for retweeting a Twitter account operated by the Russian Internet Research Company, better known as the IRA, during the election. Well, now, a new question is swirling because there are still a dozen referrals of potentially criminal evidence Mueller's team found and were all redacted for reasons of, quote, harm to an ongoing matter. We have no idea who's involved or what they're about, but Democratic Senator of Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, he's got an idea.
One thing that Bob Mueller did not do here was, in effect, follow the money. None of the financial crimes are in this report. None of the Deutsche Bank leads have been followed. That presumably is what the Southern District of New York is doing, and that's one of the reasons that perhaps Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator there, in effect, individual number one.
Aha.
Joining us now is former federal prosecutor Kathy Fleming and NBC News legal analyst Danny Ceballos. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. Danny, what do you make of this Blumenthal's follow the money?
As a broader prosecutorial approach, it makes sense, but we have to remember that the Mueller mandate was very narrow. His mission was to investigate Russian collusion and possible obstruction of justice. So, in a sense, following the money wasn't really a part of that mandate, and Mueller smartly farmed out or referred out anything that had to do with something that was outside of his original mandate. And if you remember, during the Manafort trial, Manafort's attorneys actually filed a motion to throw out his prosecution on exactly that argument, that the special counsel had exceeded his mandate. So Mueller correctly predicted that defendants might try to challenge his authority. Mueller's mandate was limited. A U.S. attorney in a particular district, not limited at all. That's
like
the benefit.
The Southern District of New
So
York.
that would all be blacked out because the Southern District of New York is working on that. And remember, Trump's business, where there would be ties, is where his family works.
Or the any district of anywhere, because these could have been referred out to anywhere beyond the Southern District, anywhere in the United States. Right. So this could be going on at any district across the country.
Kathy, Eric Prince, he was mentioned in the Mueller report. He was on our air in December of 2017 regarding a business meeting that he had in the Seychelles with
the head of the sovereign wealth fund in Russia.
Well, he sort of articulated it as just a
business
Russian business guy.
You know what? All of them are connected to the Kremlin. But here's what he said. So you were in the Seychelles. Why should you meet that Russian guy? What was the reason to meet him?
The Emirati guy said it's someone they'd done business with before, and it'd be an interesting guy for you to know because we were both involved in the commodities and energy space. So I had a beer with him. I don't know if he had a beer. He probably had vodka. But
and in that meeting,
and after that, I had no contact with him or any of his colleagues at all. So
did you
really,
know that he was an associate of President Putin's when you met him?
He was described to me as a Russian hedge fund manager.
A Russian hedge fund manager would generally be somebody who Vladimir Putin would know. But Eric Prince, more than that, was the head of Blackwater. Like, this is not a guy who just randomly runs into people and takes meetings. That kind of stuff has been left unresolved.
Well, it has been, at least with regard to what Robert Mueller was doing, and you're exactly right, that there was a much more limited he had a much limited quest than we are seeing with the other things that are going on here. And we not only have U.S. attorneys' offices that are continuing to look, we have a state attorney general's office and perhaps others that are looking at it. So we don't know what's going on with other offices, other investigations that are going on. We don't know who's talking. We have reports here of what people said in these interviews.
Right.
We don't know what else has been said either in grand juries in other places or in interviews in other places. And we still don't know even the full extent of people that cooperated. One of the things that jumped out at me was how limited the cooperation was of Rick Gates and others in terms of how good their 5K motions were at their sentencings.
Right.
Compared to what was described in the Mueller report. I thought they must have given other things that were not mentioned in the Mueller report, or else the government was a lot more generous than they seem to be in cases I'm involved in.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.